They were inquisitive, trusting, and still malleable in their development. In the Third Reich, the National Socialists shamelessly exploited the naivety of its children.
Teachers told me that the Führer wanted the best for Germany.
Youngsters were manipulated. Human values no longer counted.
Suddenly, the call came to hate, to demand separation.
Nothing was the way it once was.
Never again do I want to experience the pain of saying goodbye to someone you know will be taken away the next day.
The horror was inconceivable.
What children experienced in those camps can never be wiped from their memories.
Children in the midst of falling bombs. In World War II, daily life had become a nightmare.
Bombs were exploding all the time.
The grown-ups clung to us and we hung on to them because everyone was terrified.
A childhood spent in chaos.
All they knew was that they had to function in this tiny segment, and they did function like clockwork.
Exploited for Hitler's insane plans, the Nazis sent child soldiers into battle.
Günter, there's one over there, get him out.
These children would never forget what they had seen at the front.
No one with any common sense would have thought this possible.
What was vaunted as heroism gave way to bloody reality.
I was paralyzed with fear. What if he pulls the trigger, I thought.
What they had experienced not only haunted soldiers, even after the war.
And then we were beaten. It was appalling.
The collapse became traumatic. Many soldiers would never forget the horror.
What did you do with the child? My God, what on earth happened to you out there?
For someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, the trauma is never over.
The evil Nazi regime had exploited and betrayed them. What has remained is the pain.
Naturally, it's incredibly hard for many of them to understand that it was all an illusion, to realize that they were lied to.
We're talking about the eternal child that cried out so loudly but was never heard because there was no time or place for that.
For the gruesome war of the adults, the youngest of all sacrificed their most precious possession.
When I had overcome my disgust, I turned over the first corpse. Doing something like that is totally alien to childhood.
In the war, you just weren't a child anymore.
In the early 1940s, Allied bombing raids on German cities increased. The Second World War left Germany in ruins. Children grew up with the familiar sound of air raid sirens in their ears. Everyday life was dominated by suffering and horror, death and despair, and there was no end in sight.
The first thing you learned was that you had to be strong and function, that it was your responsibility to make sure the house was standing, that fires were put out. Sometimes we had to remove the dead from the streets. Terrible scenes, no matter how old you were. But they were part of everyday life.
To protect children from such sights and from the permanent stress of bombing raids, many youngsters were sent into the countryside, where life was safer.
The greater the scale of urban destruction, the greater the threat to the people, to children. So the state, in its self-proclaimed benevolence, launched its children's evacuation program. But many parents did not want their offspring to be taken away from them and become incorporated even more into the National Socialist state. But resistance proved fruitless. Having said goodbye to their fathers, youngsters were now being deprived of their mothers as well. There was no one close to protect them. To all intents and purposes, those who were evacuated had become orphans.
Parting was painful. But for many children, this was also an adventure, and, above all, a welcome change from the sad daily routine of life in wartime. The most popular destinations included Styria, Salzburg, Pomerania, and the Bavarian Eastern March.
Coburg Fortress looked really impressive. It was all so new to us. We were put up in a Hitler Youth home. Hitler Youth leaders from Coburg were put in charge of our group. We played field games for the first time. We had never done that here in Hamburg.
Günter Lux grew up in Hamburg in a communist family. Nevertheless, he wanted to join the Hitler Youth. When war broke out, his father could no longer prevent it. Registration was compulsory. Together with his older brother Hermann, in 1941, Günter Lux was relocated to Coburg. But when Hermann was sent home and he was supposed to stay behind in Coburg on his own, Günter hatched a plan.
Any bedwetters were sent home. And because of the traumatic experiences, there were a few of them. So I thought I'd do that too. I wet the bed on purpose. I was embarrassed, but I did it 3 or 4 times in a row. So they decided to send me home and put me on the same transport as my brother. As we talked, he asked me how I had become a bedwetter. So I told him everything. And he laughed and said I was a crafty old so-and-so. All I said was I wanted to go home with you. And I would have managed it too, because here I wasn't a bedwetter anymore.
Back at home, everyday life in the ruins continued. By now, the major cities in particular, Hamburg, Kassel, Frankfurt, Düsseldorf, Cologne and Nuremberg, were regular targets for the Allies' bombers. After devastating raids in which thousands of bombs were dropped, in 1942 the war in the air seemed to have reached its height, but the carnage still wasn't over. Ruth Winkelmann experienced the war in the capital. As the daughter of a Jew, the bombs were not her only worry. Her parents separated in order to apply for Aryanization for Ruth and her sister Esther, but without success. Before the war, they used to meet regularly with relatives, but forced labor, the bombing raids, and the fear of deportation had changed everything.
From the moment we lived alone, we on our own and Daddy on his own, there was hardly any time for family life. We did meet, but basically we had little time together. After all, from 1942 on, I had to work. 12-hour shifts daily. A week on the night shift followed by a week on the day shift, so that left hardly any time.
Then came the shock. Ruth's grandparents were to be deported. The family hadn't met for a long time. They believed better days would come and they'd be able to make up for lost time.
But an aunt of mine, my mother's youngest sister, was very close to my grandfather. She used to visit him every week and take my grandparents something. And she also knew that they were going to be arrested. So we all paid them a quick visit. Everyone was in tears. It was terrible. I never again want to experience the pain of saying goodbye to someone you know will be taken away the next day or the day after.
For 14-year-old Ruth and her family, nothing would ever be the same again. The Nazis continued to keep the world on tenterhooks. Ruth's grandparents were sent to Theresienstadt, and things would soon get even worse. In February 1943, Hermann Jax went to work as usual. But he never returned home.
My father's youngest brother came to us and said they'd arrested Daddy. A whole world collapsed. Suddenly, Daddy was gone. But I must say that in 1943, we were so preoccupied with ourselves that, although we found it terrible, each of us first focused on his or herself, and only then on the others. After all, the bombs were also taking our lives. I wept for my father, of course I did. But there was nothing much we could do about it.
It was wartime, and there was no room for grief. The children had to lend a hand. They had to be strong, hide their fear, and cope with the everyday reality of war.
Children rose above themselves and assumed tasks beyond their years. To survive in wartime, you always have to function and comply with instructions from adults. That makes you a mini-adult. But you can't necessarily assess the drama of a situation. All you know is that you have to function in this little segment. And youngsters did function, like clockwork.
For the youngest of all, the sound of an air raid siren, their mothers racing to safety, and the impact of the bombs had long since become routine for Monika Jette too.
Basically, I was always a very happy, cheerful and confident child. So sometimes I'd think, there's plenty going on down below, lots of people and so on. I don't think I realized about the dangers of being in the cellar. But you just had to make the best of the situation. What else could you do? You had to go down. There were these iron doors that were bolted shut. You sat behind them and waited till it was all over.
There was also a positive aspect to the fact that the bombs had already become routine for youngsters.
Basically, I would say that the smaller a child is, the more fragile it is. Sometimes the lack of intellectual and linguistic development can be protective. When I'm 11 months old and can barely say "mama," I don't understand what my parents and grandparents are saying about the situation and how dangerous it is. I'm experiencing the dangerous nature of the situation, but everyone is there. All the people who have always protected me are present. They are all running around. And there are lots of loud noises. But I'm on my mother's arm.
But child and youth therapist Dr. Andreas Krüger knows that in many cases it takes only a second, and suddenly nothing will ever be the same again.
The infant experiences sitting in the bunker with its mother and being breastfed. Then a bomb hits. Everybody screams. And suddenly the supply of milk from its mother stops. The infant turns into a crybaby and becomes more strenuous in this insane war. It develops post-traumatic stress syndrome. The noise, the commotion, and the mother's inability to reassure her child because of her fear all result in the child developing PTSD.
The experiences children made in the war varied. What they all had in common were permanent stress and constant fear.
I only knew that it was all about survival. Where can we get something to eat? Are we still safe in our apartment? The cellars were often broken into. Some people said my father had already come back. Others received the famous letter, "Fallen for the fatherland."
Werner, Monika's father, had been at the front since 1939. He had volunteered for military service.
It was a great opportunity for him. He was an illegitimate child in Berlin after the First World War. At the time, that was an absolute disaster. He wanted to study. He could have started an apprenticeship as a tradesman, but that's not what he wanted. He sought out the Nazis in the belief that it would enable him to make something of his life.
Born in 1940, Monika Jette experienced the Second World War with her mother and elder sister in Berlin. She didn't meet her father until after the war. She only knows what he was like before then from what her mother told her.
When he and my mother first met, he must have been a really dashing young man. She fell in love with him and couldn't wait to get married. She was a strict Catholic, but he was Protestant, so he had to convert. They had a big 3-day country wedding in Upper Silesia, even though at the time he was already a Junker. But he did it out of love for my mother.
He wanted to really make something of his life, and the Nazis offered Monika's father this opportunity at the Ordensburg, an elite academy of the NSDAP. But as a candidate for the party's leadership cadre, he and his wife were expected to turn their backs on religion.
She told him he had to decide. It's either me or the Führer, she said. So he left the Ordensburg and volunteered for an airborne unit. He became a paratrooper. He did not renounce the Führer, of course, but he did break off his training at the Ordensburg because my mother was against it.
In 1943, the war finally became part of life in the capital. For Ellie Jacks, everyday life became a challenge. Her Jewish husband had been deported. Her daughters, Ruth and Esther, lived in constant fear. A mere trifle could trigger off a disaster.
My mother had to collect our ration cards from the card center because my father had been picked up. She was especially afraid for my sister and me. While she was collecting the ration cards, we were supposed to go to Aunt Greta, her eldest sister. She was a civil servant and was thus not permitted to have Jewish guests. So I had to remove the star I was wearing. At the ration card center, SS soldiers told my mother they needed to see her children before any cards could be issued. My mother and the men then all came by car to pick us up. But we weren't given any ration cards. Instead, we were arrested.
The family was taken to the collection point in the Große Hamburger Straße. Together with many other frightened people, Ellie, Ruth and little Eddie waited for further instructions.
Then a young man in uniform, probably SS, came down the steps and hit my sister in the head with his rifle butt. Just imagine, a 6-year-old child. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there. She clenched her teeth and looked him up and down. It was a terrible experience. There was nothing we could do. Then an official turned up and asked Mummy why she was there. She said she was the mother of the 2 children. He wanted to know about her bloodline. She told him she was Aryan and that her children were half Jewish.
It was a lie. According to the Nazis' race laws, the children were considered legally to be Jews, so it was compulsory for them to wear the Star of David. And in the event of a deportation order, they would not be spared. But half-Jews, as they were known, were not forced to wear the star and were further down the killers' list. Ellie Jacks risked everything and saved her children.
Since I was not wearing the star on my coat, that saved me. I was really scared.
This fear for your own life and fear for those you love, ran deep. Often, survivors just couldn't get rid of the feeling. It changed children, some of them forever.
Experts describe a situation in which a person's life is threatened, from which there is no escape, when a feeling of powerlessness arises that exceeds anything they have ever known before, as traumatic impotence. This constellation can affect anyone, old or young, infant or grandparent. Irrespective of age, the experience can trigger something in the brain which we call post-traumatic stress disorder. It is the symptomatic, primordial soup, so to speak, which can cause highly complex damage.
Nazi terror was palpable in Hamburg too. The regime never mentioned that countless soldiers were dying at the front every day. It continued to glorify the war. Further recruits were trained, and in September 1942, there was nothing Hermann Lux could do to prevent being conscripted. Günter's father was called up and sent to the front. His sons, 14-year-old Günter and 15-year-old Hermann, went to live with their mother, stepfather Helmut, and 2 half-sisters. It was a return to a household that was still firmly communist, but everyday life in wartime played a leading role.
Political views took a back seat. The bombing raids were heavy, and so the fight for survival took over. Political activities were almost non-existent. My mother put up personal resistance merely on a minor scale. For instance, defying custom, she refused to hang out flags to mark the Führer's birthday. Every second household displayed a swastika. But she just hung a small piece of bedding out of the window. The block leader was furious. My mother said, "What am I supposed to do? My little ones have wet the bed, and I have to dry the bedding. Have you got any other suggestion?" "Typical scum," was his reply. The next day, when the Führer's birthday was over, the piece of bedding was dry. That was the kind of mini-resistance she offered. But you had to be very careful.
In their new home, brothers Günter and Hermann experienced a totally different aspect of the war. Stepfather Helmut Kuschak continued to maintain contact with his old comrades. It kept him informed of things which government propaganda kept secret.
There were, of course, the Volksempfänger, the people's wirelesses, which broadcast official propaganda. But we were given a large radio set, and my stepfather used to listen to the news from London. I listened too. We'd pull the blanket over our heads because we had to be careful. We might have been arrested. So the woolen blanket was pulled over our heads, and we'd tune in. This is Radio London. We heard news that made our hair stand on end. Things we'd never had heard from the official stations. They would broadcast reports like 36 British aircraft were destroyed in aerial combat over the Channel, with the loss of 2 of our own planes. But in reality, it was exactly the other way round.
It was too cramped in the small apartment for 6 people. With every bomb that fell on Hamburg, fear grew, and with it the danger that after the all clear in the air raid bunker, like many others, they would be homeless. And yet in the summer of 1943, everything changed for the Lux brothers. Their stepfather, Helmut Kuschak, was transferred to the Czech Protectorate to build aircraft. Elisabeth and the small children went with him. Günter and Hermann remained alone in their apartment in Hammerbrook.
Aunt Olga, who had a greengrocer's in the same street, had to become our legal guardian and ensure that we were fed. But we lived alone in the apartment.
On the 24th and 25th of July 1943, Hamburg was bombed by the Allies. 791 British aircraft dropped over 2,000 tons of incendiaries and explosives on the Hanseatic city. In the afternoon, American bombers attacked.
The first two air raids were devastating, but it was mainly the port area, Altona, which got hit. We were in the cellar, under our house. The next bunker was much too far away, and we didn't feel like running over to it. We always trusted that nothing worse would happen. The next day, I was roaming around Hamburg a bit and found a leaflet about the size of a postcard. On it was written, "That was just the beginning. Other air raids will follow. Leave the city to avoid further unnecessary casualties. The Royal Air Force." I quickly threw it in a waste bin. After all, I had been told that passing on information like that was tantamount to spreading enemy propaganda, and that carried the death penalty. I don't know if that was true, but I was scared, of course. When I told my brother, he said, "That really is enemy propaganda. The British suffered such heavy losses the first time, they won't come back." If only he had been right.
It was the night of July the 28th, 1943.
We always left the radio on low. One day, Hermann woke me up and said, "Get up, Günter. There's a report coming through. A large force of enemy aircraft, they say, is on its way to northwest Germany." We had often heard that before. And it had often been the case that the aircraft had flown onto Berlin or Hanover. But this time, they were heading for us once again.
739 bombers targeted the districts east of Hamburg city centre, Rothenburg's Ort, Burgfelder and Hammerbrook, where Günter and Hermann Lux also lived.
Shortly after the sirens began to wail, the flak units opened up. Then the bombs started to fall. We dashed into the air raid shelter in our cellar. We waited and stared at the ceiling. Outside, all hell was let loose. It was terrible. In the cellar, there were several women and children, and 6 or 7 elderly men. One of them suffered a heart attack, and one woman screamed hysterically, "Help! Stop it!" It was horrific.
Bombs fell incessantly on Hamburg's residential areas. In next to no time, the buildings in Hammerbrook were ablaze.
The house in our backyard suddenly collapsed. It had probably been hit by a large bomb. Then there was this loud bang up above, and someone said, "That hit us." We ran up 4 or 5 floors to the attic and found everything was on fire. An incendiary had struck the skylight. There was no way we would extinguish anything, so we ran back down. I tore off my gas mask because something was burning my neck. I passed out. My brother carried me down, and we waited in some small space. I opened the door and saw how people were running past. One man doubled up and immediately burned to death. I went out, but the hot air from the firestorm hurled me back. Incendiaries were lying in the streets. Then Hermann had this crazy idea and said he had to go out and check on Aunt Olga. She lived only a few houses away. "Wait," I said. I'm coming with you. No, stay here. She'll have to save herself. But he went out and never returned.
Frantic, Günter waited for his brother. There was chaos all around. The heat from the flames, the sound of exploding bombs, falling rubble. No one could feel safe in their apartment anymore.
After a while, I told myself that I had to get out. The building next to ours had collapsed. And in our house, too, bits of rubble, the banisters and things, were also falling down. I just had to get out. An old lady was staggering along the street, totally disoriented. I pulled her down with me to grab some air in the cracks between the cobblestones. When the firestorm ebbed a little, we got back to our feet and ran some more until we reached the Norderstraße. The school there was full of people, hundreds of them. Some were injured. Others were suffering from burns. Every classroom was full. Hardly anyone had more than the clothes they were wearing. Only one or two had managed to pack a suitcase. I looked out of the window and saw that Eastern Hamburg was burning from end to end. Wherever you looked, all you could see were flames.
The hot wind in those summer days fanned the mix of aerial mines, high-explosive bombs, phosphorus and other incendiary bombs even more. A firestorm swept through the streets. Günter rested in the school building in the Norderstraße, but not for long. He wanted to continue looking for his brother.
In the early morning, making my way through rubble, I went straight back to Hammerbrook. There were dead bodies everywhere. I turned over corpses that looked male to see whether it was Hermann lying there. After I had checked a few bodies, an army officer appeared and said, "By rights I ought to shoot you, because you are robbing the dead." I was in tears and said, "So do it then. I have just about had enough. I'm looking for my brother." He relaxed and said that was okay. But he wanted me to help remove the corpses. I can't do that, I told him, and ran away.
Günter continued his search for his brother and for somewhere to sleep in the nights ahead. Hardly anything was left of Hammerbrook. Ruth had escaped the threat of deportation. Her traumatic experience at the collecting point had terrified her. What if she wasn't so lucky the next time? Ellie, Ruth and Esther needed a plan.
As we left the Große Hamburger Straße, we ran into my aunt, my mother's youngest sister. The children can't come to the Pappelallee anymore, she said. That's now out of the question. She and my mother then discussed what to do with us. My aunt had an idea. Herr Lindenberg had always said that if my mother were in difficulties, she should turn to him. So Mummy went to see Herr Lindenberg, and he told her we could move into the summer house. He was going to be called up, and the place would be empty anyway. So we moved into Herr Lindenberg's summer house.
The hut and the allotment colony outside the city centre gave the yaks hope and fresh courage. The family's friend, Leo Lindenberg, did not hesitate to help the three in their need.
He was a typical German civil servant, incredibly small-minded, but he had a big heart and was very religious, a devout Christian. I must say that he fell in love with my mother the very first time he set eyes on her. I can't imagine any other reason why a man would take in two Jewish children. From the moment our parents separated, he probably sensed that he stood a chance.
Moving into the allotment was absolutely essential. But even so, 14-year-old Ruth found it hard to give up her home.
I had always been used to living in large, well-lit rooms, but the biggest room in the summer house was 2 meters square and packed with junk. When the temperature dropped below freezing, our water supply froze. We had a pit toilet, which meant fetching water from the pump. It was a tough time.
The summer house was a particularly good place to hide from the Nazis. The yaks didn't have to worry about anyone informing on them. No one in the neighborhood asked any questions. Ellie Yaks had worked out a credible story for herself and her daughters.
We told neighbors we'd been bombed out like lots of people in Berlin, and that Herr Lindenberg had offered us his summer house. It was all official, we said, and everyone accepted that.
To maintain their cover, the Yaks had to keep convincing people that they were Aryans loyal to the regime. The civil servant status of their landlord proved particularly helpful.
Herr Lindenberg was a party member. His sole job was to collect money for winter relief, and I had to take it over. With my tin in my hand, once a month, I rang the doorbells of people in the allotment colony and asked for a donation. Sometimes I'd be sent packing. "Clear off, you Nazi brat. You'll not get a penny from us." That was the best thing that could have happened to me. I was accepted as a Nazi brat, and that was fine with me right through to 1945.
The Harmony allotment colony in Berlin-Wittenau provided protection for Ellie Yaks and especially for her persecuted daughters. But Ruth was missing her freedom. One summer's day in 1943, she could no longer stand it in the cramped hut.
It was extremely hot in Herr Lindenberg's summer house. I told my mother I was going bathing in Lübars. She warned me to be careful. When I was lying there, a boy asked me if I'd like to play dodgeball. And I thought, why not? The lifeguard, Herr Schwedhelm, told me that they needed someone to join their youth group. So I did. And no one asked any questions. "My name is Ruth," I said. After all, it's not a name that would raise eyebrows.
Ruth Yaks was outside again, enjoying life with friends once more. She learned how to swim, and that summer managed for a few hours a day to forget the war and the threat of deportation, until reality caught up with her again.
Word went out that we were all to be given reports, but that meant showing a membership card of the League of German Girls. And I didn't have one, of course. So I came up with 1,000 excuses. One day, Frau Schwedhelm took me to one side. "I need to take the dog for a walk," she said. "I'd like you to join me, because there's something I have to talk to you about." I suspected what might be in store. Well, after much humming and hawing, I came clean and said that I was half Jewish, that I should actually be wearing the Star of David, that I was living semi-clandestinely and that I had no identity card. You'll get your report without a card, she said, and we'll pretend that this conversation never took place. And that's what happened. I have to express my gratitude to the Schwedhelms. Through them, I was able to enjoy a few carefree hours.
After the air raids of Operation Gomorrah, Günter Lux had to fend for himself in Hamburg. The firestorm had burnt itself out, but any buildings still standing were gutted. The east of Hamburg lay in ruins.
The other nights I just dossed down somewhere, at the main station, because the subway was no longer in use, or in ruined buildings. I went to the Moorweide, where food was being doled out to people who were now homeless. They had butter churns, bread and sugar, and I got a crust of bread and some sugar. But that didn't last. Go to the university, I was told. You'll also get some travel documents. So I did. I told them my parents were in the Protectorate, so they gave me a travel pass to go there.
Günter Lux set out for what is today the Czech Republic. It was a long train journey that took him through Dresden, Prague and Brno. In Tischnowitz, 14-year-old Günter asked if the name Krušák was familiar to anyone. And his luck was in. In the end, totally exhausted, he arrived at the house where his stepfather and his mother lived.
She looked at me and took me in her arms. "Günter, my son," she cried. But then she immediately asked me about Hermann. All I could tell her was that he was missing.
Elisabeth Krušák was beside herself. She set out for Hamburg to look for her eldest son. But she drew a blank. Hermann was nowhere to be found. In despair, his mother returned to the Protectorate. After his grim experiences in Hamburg, Günter remained with his family in the present-day Czech Republic. In the summer of 1944, Helmut Krušák's job there was done, so the family all returned to Hamburg.
The whole family lived in the cellar of a ruined building in Horn. My mother was heavily pregnant, and in August 1944, little Helmut was born. It was then just too cramped in the two-room cellar, with 3 children and 2 adults, and me always in between.
Günter could not abandon the hope of seeing his brother Hermann again. He had been hoping for months for some sign of life, but there was nothing.
My stepfather told me it was pointless. "Stop searching," he said. "He's dead." After that, even my mother gave up. And besides, what could you do? They built a wall around Hammerbrook and Rothenburgsort and declared the districts a no-go area because of the risk of an epidemic. And if you went to see the authorities, you just got turned away. So in time you simply resign yourself to the situation. But I always felt like an alien in the family. It was so cramped where we lived. I had just a small corner in the ruins. Some toys, books and magazines from the post office.
Just as the Hitler Youth freely declared its loyalty to the Führer and the Reich when war broke out, today it has become a movement of volunteers for military service. In a rally at a historic site, a report was given to the Führer on volunteers born in the year 1928. The East Prussia region herewith registers 9,482 volunteers from the Hitler Youth for military service.
Then came an order affecting the Home Guard. All men between the ages of 16 and 60 were to be called up and had to register. That, I thought, is a chance to get out of this cellar. And besides, according to the newsreels, the Bolsheviks were committing atrocities in East Prussia, murdering people and children. This had such an effect on me that I said I'd help to prevent that if I could. My mother reckoned that was senseless. Forget it, she said. Stay here. But my stepfather said, let him go. The war's nearly over anyway. He won't be sent to the front. He'll do training and then come back. I had the feeling that he was thinking about one less mouth to feed, which I suppose was somehow understandable.
In the winter of 1944, the people of Berlin tried to save the last belongings they had left. By now, the war had destroyed almost everything. For 2 years, Ruth had heard nothing from her father, Hermann. All she knew was that in February 1943, he had been deported to Monowitz. With the Star of David on her jacket, every trip to the city centre was fraught with danger for the 16-year-old, but she also met people who were kind to her.
I was coming from my aunt's and had to cross the Alte Schönhauser Straße. The tar on the road was on fire, but I had to get through. People soaked woolen blankets in water and wrapped them around us. First, we also had to soak our shoes. At the end of the street, the blankets had to be handed back. They still gave me a woolen blanket, even though I was wearing a star on my jacket.
Just before Christmas, Ruth had to fear for her life once again.
Factory searches were being carried out and arrests made in a final roundup, if you like. I had heard of these operations, and when I mentioned them to a colleague, he said I should go and see my doctor. Maybe he could help. He asked me whether I still had my appendix. Yes, I told him. So I went to the doctor's and he said I should eat some undercooked potatoes. I had no idea where I could get hold of potatoes, but the doctor gave me some. Just cut them in half, he said, and when they're only half done, swallow them and wait a few hours. Your appendix will automatically become inflamed. And don't take too much care over personal hygiene. So I did all that, and he sent me to hospital. My doctor came to see me every 2 days. The search operations were still being carried out, so each time he opened up my wound again so that I could stay in hospital a few days longer. As a result, I avoided detection.
But the danger was by no means over. Fear and terror continued to rule in Germany. Hitler's victims longed to be liberated by the Allies.